Thank you very much, and thank you especially to the organisers for inviting me. All the Beauty of the World is a lovely title for a conference, and it conjures up an image of a world in which beauty may be found in every corner, from Tibet to Vienna to Timbuktu. That is the world we know today, partly through our own application of common aesthetic principles and partly through the pervasive effect of a comparatively recent epistemological phenomenon, that of cultural relativism, in which the Western elites in particular have learnt to place equivalent value on diverse cultures, rising above the prejudices of earlier centuries. But here in Berlin, we are talking about those earlier centuries, and as we know anyway, although all cultures are equal, some are seen to be more equal than others. And I am here to talk about one of those cultures and the European market for its objects, Aboriginal Australia. Excuse me. I want to begin with a few slides, and I'll skip that one. I'll get back to that. A few slides just to introduce you to the form and appearance of the artefacts which are the subject of this talk, originating from what we might call the fifth continent, Australia, which was still barely imagined by Europeans, even beyond its discovery during the late 18th century. I want to draw your attention to the fineness of line with which these watercolour drawings are executed, and to mark the differential between the appreciation we feel when we see these today and the concomitant implication or shadow of value which we automatically attach to what amounts to a brochure for sale. And on one hand, and on the other hand, the general low regard in which Aboriginal cultural material was held at the time these drawings were made, which was 1905. That low regard reflected the status of their makers, Aboriginal people themselves, as the quintessential primitive race. Our historical awareness of this disparity and disjunction has helped to feed a contemporary assumption, widely held by many academics, that Aboriginal artefacts in museums, as with many other Indigenous art collections, are misappropriated and are in the wrong place and should be returned. That isn't the topic of today's lecture, but it is one of the subjects of my Australian research, and I should say that my work on frontier archives does not align with the orthodoxy of misappropriation. This research does not deny the role of violence and uneven frontier transactions in the formation of collections, but it does reveal the primary role of Aboriginal people themselves as agents in deploying objects for their own momentary advantage in zones of exchange and mutual curiosity on various Australian frontiers. That is another story, but with great relevance to this conference, as the feedback from European markets milieu reached not only the collectors themselves, but in several important cases, remote Aboriginal communities in central, northern and southern Australia. This feedback can be observed in several ways and at various levels. At a broad level, in terms of responding with increased production of existing repertoire, some small and modified expansions of that repertoire, but also particular additions or interventions to objects which can be traced directly from the metropole, manifesting themselves in curious ways on objects. And just one of these, I'll skip over that, that's the 250 language groups in Aboriginal Australia. This is an example from the Basel collection. Such an example is the appearance of red sealing wax as an analogue for red ochre on Aboriginal clubs from northern Queensland. Something that puzzled me for several years until we analysed it. Sealing wax arriving in remote Aboriginal communities via letters and parcels addressed to Europeans, tossed away and put perhaps in the waste paper basket, and picked up by Aboriginal people who recognise the consistency as being so close to red ochre and being able to melt it, just as they melted spinifex resin, and apply it to their own objects, possibly with the association in their minds of the origin of those letters coming from the centre of metropolis, possibly with a crown seal on the sealing wax from Queen Victoria. There are other examples of this sort of thing, but that's sort of parenthetic at the moment. Also parenthetically, I would propose that the ease, even the insouciance with which Aboriginal objects were often acquired on the frontier might also reflect the relatively low values ascribed to these objects by distant markets during the 19th century. This was not to change greatly until one category of object came into view at the turn of the 20th century through the publications and collecting activities of the anthropologists Spencer and Gillen and the missionary ethnographer Carl Strelo. And if you add up the collections of Aboriginal material in Europe, extraordinarily enough, as many as I would say 40% of those objects come from those three individuals. I'll get back to that. But these objects, which Spencer and Gillen and Carl Strelo each wrote about in the 1890s and published in their sort of epoch-making books in anthropological historical terms, the Totemic Tablets known as Turinga, made of stone or wood, talismanic objects in the world histories of magic, religion and belief. And it was the light cast on these objects and the reflected light which was projected back into the collecting field, which began to shift the values upwards for Aboriginal material, but not too high, not very high at all as it happens. As these values began to shift though, experts emerged and the market began to mature in a more complex way, and naked desire for these objects began to affect relations with the Aboriginal people of Central Australia. Direct thefts of caches of Turinga from bush keeping places directly augmented museum collections. But so did the decisions of Aboriginal elders to begin exchanging these objects, apparently and freely of their own accord, to missionaries, to anthropologists, and to the first tourists and travellers in Central Australia. The enhanced values for Aboriginal material rippled through the networks of collectors, dealers, museums, and rolled back to touch Aboriginal communities themselves. It is perhaps a remarkable testament to the Aboriginal commitment to exact and unvarying reiteration of traditional forms that despite a total of more than a dozen collections of like objects assembled by the Lutheran missionaries Strelo, Liebler and Reuter, amounting to some 6,000 objects, of which 4,000 are in Britain and Germany, there is almost no variation or departure from the types documented from the onset of this first wave of enhanced value and interest. And I guess those are the objects which I showed you in the first slides. The second great wave, or ripple, you might say, in the formation of value has involved the complex phenomenon of the discovery or recreation, in some cases, of Aboriginal art as a phenomenon during the 1980s, but this falls outside the topic today. The formation and refinement of European taste and the market which tested and measured its values had already been operating for at least a century before Captain James Cook's discovery, so-called, of Aboriginal Australia in 1776. There's no time here to go into the various frameworks of the broader market, although it's worth bearing in mind that the markets for curios, natural history specimens, ethnographic artefacts and antiquities overlapped considerably and all fell within the ambit of interest of many collectors, such as Sir John Soane, for example, in London, many others. Aside from the rather bizarre curiosity cabinets, though, connoisseurs of ethnographic material during the 18th and early 19th centuries were not applying standards or principles radically different from those applied by collectors of fine art or furniture or objects of virtue or sculpture. And these particular forms of connoisseurship, which aligned ideals of intricacy, finesse, symmetry and elegance, harmony in colour and form, etc., had already elevated particular forms of weaponry and adornment well above utilitarian objects distinguished primarily for their fitness for purpose. In this sense, the Hawaiian cloaks collected by Cook, Banks and Parkinson could be admired chiefly for their own intrinsic qualities and stand alone, while a brace of clubs, arrows or spears from the Pacific or North America or Australia might find their most appealing effect as trophy displays, grouped as a radiating installation on a drawing room wall. And was that appeal, that sort of arrangement, sufficient to sustain or boost a market for Australian Aboriginal objects? There was no El Dorado for Australian Aboriginal objects. So what criteria remained which might render them desirable and impel particular collectors or markets to find a place for these objects? Two things can be mentioned. Notions of exoticism propelled Aboriginal objects to a forward position in this respect. Any object identifiable as Aboriginal served this purpose in the early phase, and the Aboriginal object par excellence was, of course, the boomerang. This object quickly reached iconic status, quickly after about 1825, I would say, intriguing Europeans sufficiently for it to be copied and reproduced for a domestic market. It was the ideal Christmas gift in the 1830s. During this early phase, i.e. from the time of the first fleet through to the 1830s, it was sufficient to know that an object derived from a culture at the ends of the earth in geographic terms, representing the antipodes of the European imagination, for collectors to acquire some Aboriginal artefacts. An additional rationale emerged through the gradual acceptance of the notion arrived at by all accepted measures of the time, generally racist in their characterizations, that Aboriginal culture represented the most primitive form of human culture. By this rationale, Aboriginal objects came to occupy a benchmark position within collections, helping to mark the achievements of other cultures rather than Aboriginal culture itself. As evolutionist theory took hold, this particular role for Australian ethnographic material became clarified and enhanced, notably through the form of international exhibitions, which have been mentioned several times. These exhibitions were the most important stimulus in the international traffic of collections of Aboriginal material from the mid-19th century. These carnivals of the industrial age motivated governments and local agencies to encourage collectors at the frontier not only to gather artifacts from indigenous peoples, but to catalogue and describe the material so that it made sense to an eclectic audience already prepared to encounter a vast and extensive taxonomy of industrial objects, arranged as exhibits according to a fluid and evolving set of categorizations. The taxonomy of ethnographic artifacts, which sat beneath and within those broad categories of industry and progress, for which the exhibitions became known, also formed the basis of museum taxonomies during this period. Many of the collections acquired specifically for the exhibitions by officials and private collectors on the frontiers of colonial settlement were subsequently obtained by public museums. American museums seem to have been quicker than their European or Australian counterparts in using the exhibitions as an opportunity for adding to their collections. The nucleus of Chicago's Field Museum was formed from the ethnographic collections at the 1893 World's Fair. The Smithsonian Institution obtained many of the artifacts exhibited at the Philadelphia exhibition of 1876, while in contrast, the Australian material, for example, that was exhibited in Paris in 1878, has all but disappeared. There are some shields at the Quai Branly, which come from the Victorian contribution to that exhibition. The exhibitions also exerted an important direct effect on private collectors who understood that their personal tastes and preferences for objects might coincide with those sanctioned by the exhibition judges, for example. Each first order of merit awarded for an array of spears or clubs no doubt provided inspiration for new collectors who recognized their own opportunities. And indirectly, although this is much more difficult to discern or track, some indication of those preferences was relayed to Aboriginal people themselves, the producers of artifacts on the frontier, who began responding to an emerging market and in this sense could be said to possess some agency in shaping it. The exhibitions exerted their effect as validators of cultural collections very effectively, in part because they coincided with two or three other key developments: the commencement of what has been called the museum age. Most major ethnographic museums came into being at exactly the same period, and the foundation of what would emerge as academic anthropology, preceded by the establishment of societies devoted to the study of ethnography, publishing their own journals, often illustrated with engravings, and later photographs of objects and of Aboriginal people themselves. Monographs devoted to these subjects were also published, both in Australia and in Britain. The ground seemed to have been well prepared for a healthy market in Aboriginal artefacts, and in a sense, that's exactly what happened, but not quite in the way that you might expect. We know that one of the chief appeals and characteristics of the Orient and of Orientalism, if I can use those taboo words, has been its influence on European taste and aesthetics. And to that extent, the West has been open to different ways of perceiving and understanding what we might call beauty, just as occurred in other cultures influenced by Europe. But as is surely always the case, beauty carries an implication of its opposite. The very definition of the pejorative term primitivism might be that cultures bearing this imprint, such as that of the Australian Aborigines, did not achieve the transference of their own aesthetic to other cultures until perhaps very recently. Certainly there were collectors of Aboriginal material culture and artefacts during the period of this study, but might it be the case that these collectors were already at the margin of good taste and were unable, as a general rule, to convey their enthusiasm much further than their own circles, with one major exception? this was the relatively high take-up of Aboriginal artefacts by European museums. And this is really one of my key points, I suppose. I'll skip over this, which is a slide just sort of indicating the challenge that awaits the researcher delving and digging into provenance in European museums. The one on the left is from Zurich, and it's sort of characteristic in that the earlier record, such as this one from Dresden, has the collector's name at the bottom of the card. Strangely enough, to me, it seems to have been a category which has fallen off in the mid-20th century. Museums, or mid-late 20th century, museums seem to think that the collector information is not so relevant. It is often not on the websites, for example. But, of course, it's there. This is the diagram that has been sort of absorbing my obsessive tendencies in recent days, and you won't be able to read it, and don't worry. But I'll just talk you through it with the help of this little laser beam. Along the bottom here are the cultures, the sources of material in Aboriginal Australia. Over here are New South Wales and Queensland pastoral stations, Perth and Albany, Kimberley, Murray River, and the line through Central Australia, the spine of the Overland Telegraph with its stations. And those were the opportunities presented to a range of individuals who just almost by happenstance ended up with Aboriginal material. More concerted efforts were made from these localities, which are all mission stations, Christian mission stations. So they're disconnected from the diagram at this point, although I'd love to have the skills of the previous speakers in tweaking such information. We move just to the centre here. These are museums through Europe where I've worked and sort of scrutinised the collections. Over here are some Australian museums, and of course this is my museum here. But we've got also Manchester, Frankfurt, Hamburg, Leipzig, I was going to say Benin, but it's Berlin, Cologne, Stuttgart, Cambridge, Zurich, Bremen. And I've spent time in those places too, but not to the extent. Now, out of all that comes a huge number of collectors, and there's, it's just impossible to fit them on. But the next rung, these are people who more or less have achieved expert status in relation to these localities in Europe, and became the intermediaries close by those museums, and in some cases actually visited Australia to collect, either for natural history purposes or ethnographic purposes. Above them are missionaries, and they're sort of heavyweight collectors, you could say. Hundreds of objects coming from these men who are working on these missions down here. And then right at the top, a range, a sort of miscellany, really almost picked at random. Individuals who either, who were on the ground in Australia. And they could be, for example, this fellow here was a telegraph operator, this fellow was the governor of Victoria, this fellow brought the first Aboriginal cricket team to Europe in the 1860s. Christensen was a natural scientist, and Kroner, where's he gone? Oh, there. He went to observe the eclipse of the sun in the Pacific in 1875 and stopped in Australia and made a collection. So, I mean, you've got all sorts of people. And, of course, the lines between are important in that they link these individuals with museums, and then you follow the lines further and you find that there's another category along here which are dealers, and we've heard about those dealers, and the name Oldman has been mentioned, Webster, Jamrak, who also ran a zoo or a menagerie, and this is relevant to the ships arriving in England or anywhere, Hamburg, for example, where the zoo in Hamburg, which is a direct result of this maritime contact, also has its corollary in the Godefroy Museum. So the live animals go to the zoo and the artifacts go to the museum. Sometimes the animals die in the zoo and then they go to the museum. You know, that happens all over the world. And then there are some really important collectors, key intermediaries who seem to live for Aboriginal material, and they're quite rare, obviously, but they do exist. And Enrico Giglioli is here. He seemed to have the gift, which very few other people did, of actually inveigling artifacts out of museums, even if they'd already been registered. And so he's somebody who becomes very important because his collection actually only ends up in one place, which is the Pigarini Museum in Rome. But you can see the number of lines connecting him to dealers and to other individuals on the frontier. Emil Clements is another one who makes multiple collections in Western Australia during the 1890s. So I'm not going to get lost in my own diagram. But the fact is that Aboriginal material rarely broke into the broader market in Europe. It was rarely desired sufficiently. Even in museums, where it did arrive directly, more directly than other cultural material, I would say, it was treated almost as a marginal culture and became pretty well invisible. And even now, Australian material has a lesser profile than, I would say, New Caledonia. And it reminds me of the surrealist map of the world, which was produced in 1929, where Easter Island, New Guinea and New Caledonia, I think, are larger than Australia. I'll move to the end of my talk, and move on to this question: how were such objects, as I've been discussing, valued in different ways? How could they be acquired so readily? How could they leave the culture of origin and make that journey so quickly, so readily? This plays into the discussion of values ascribed to objects, but it brings us to the fundamental issue of whether our own relations to possessions in the West, in which objects seem to define us, whether those attitudes were shared by Aboriginal people. It's an assumption which comes easily to most of us. And it is true that the message coming from Aboriginal people today seems to align with that idea, but it wasn't necessarily the case in the 19th century. There's an abundance of evidence that the initial acquisition and transactions were entered into in good faith, were entirely voluntary for the most part, and were usually accompanied by consideration which may appear derisory today, such as you see here. Certainly the relative depth of feeling about objects differs between cultures. Aboriginal objects moved from a culture which did not attach the same significance to objects, with one or two key exceptions, and their longevity as our own does, until quite recently, and certainly during the period we're considering, the Aboriginal emphasis was on the word, the transmitted stories of the landscape in personalised, enlivened and sacred form. As far as an object was concerned, with its owner's life so subject to the vagaries of sociality, weather and distance, each day could be its last. Sacred objects do constitute an important exception. Put it another way, the historical and ethnographic record provides no instance of an Aboriginal person, male or female, accumulating objects for themselves during the frontier period. The potlatch ceremonies of northeast Canada could not be imagined in Aboriginal Australia. This does not diminish the sense of attachment which Aboriginal possessed for their objects, but it suggests that the key attitude towards the loss of that object might have been resignation. Having said that, the commitment to reiteration of existing forms, the conservatism of reproduction as it relates to artefacts among Aboriginal people, enables us to understand that many of the artefacts traded with Europeans made that transition with little regret from Aboriginal people. In a sense, their objects were surplus and alienable. They could readily be exchanged for the exotic surplus commodities brought by Europeans: flour, tea, sugar, tobacco, metal, cloth, even sealing wax. One surplus was exchanged for another. I often think of an exhibition which might consist of a set of scales in an empty room, perhaps a room like this, with one large dish filled to overflowing with those European commodities, and the other filled to the brim with spears and boomerangs, girdles and necklaces, shields and containers, churunga and headdresses. Perhaps those scales are tilted, but at the moment of encounter, they were often in balance. Today, one dish is empty, and the contents of the other dish are scattered through museums far and wide. Is the transaction complete? Thank you.